After today, there's only 4 days left of 2020. Since today is December 27th, 2020, since 2020 is about to end, I thought it would be a nice thing to make a video series talking about what all took place in 2020. Basically, summarizing this year and what all happened. And it's mostly focused on the United States. I'm mostly focused on what all took place in the United States, but some of the things I talk about will also be related to the entire world as a whole. So I decided I would split this video series up into 5 parts, and this video is the second part out of 5. So yesterday was part 1 of 5, and the reason why I did that is because I thought that doing it all in one video, there wouldn't be enough time for that. I thought that it would be better to split 2020 up into 5 different sections and have each section be its own video because I thought that there was just too much that took place this year for it to all be one video. So yesterday the video covered everything that took place from January 1, 2020 to March 10th, 2020. And if you didn't watch that video, you can watch that after this video. But basically, here's the 5 second summary. Trump's impeachment trials in the Senate, COVID 19 starts to spread mainly in China, and the Democratic primaries take place and Joe Biden essentially emerges as the nominee. So there's 2 reasons why I made the cutoff for the first section March 10th and the cutoff for the second section March 11th. I mentioned one of the reasons why in yesterday's video because on March 10th, 2020, that is when Super Tuesday 2 took place in the Democratic primaries. There were 6 primaries on that date. And on that day, Joe Biden won 5 of those 6 primaries, and most people acknowledged by then that Joe Biden would eventually become the nominee and that Bernie Sanders had basically no shot at it at that point because Joe Biden just had too much support on his side. Because candidates like Mayor Pete, Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg is Mayor Pete by the way, Amy Klobuchar and Beto O'Rourke had all endorsed Joe Biden, so he had so much more support than Bernie Sanders did. That is why he was essentially the nominee by March 10th. But the second reason why I ended that section off on March 10th and I'm starting this section off on March 11th. The second reason is because that is when the World Health Organization first declared COVID 19 a global pandemic. So, this video will be covering the section of 2020 that took place between March 11th, 2020 and May 24th, 2020. So, on March 11th, 2020, that is when the World Health Organization declared COVID 19 a pandemic. That's also when the NBA first announced that they were canceling their games. That's also when Tom Hanks got COVID 19. It was announced that he got COVID 19. Now, the reason why this date is significant, March 11th, is because this is exactly when COVID 19 actually entered the consciousness of most people's minds. Like, it became a serious deal on that date. Most people already knew about the virus, but up until that point, most people didn't think it was a serious deal. They mainly thought it was just a thing affecting China, but it wouldn't get bad in the United States. But on March 11th, it was declared a pandemic. The NBA had to cancel their games, and Tom Hanks himself had gotten the virus. Tom Hanks is a famous actor, so obviously that made a lot of people treat this virus differently. The fact that someone they knew, someone they possibly looked up to, got this virus. So March 11th is when most people started to panic over this virus, and March 11th onwards is also when lockdowns first started being implemented, social distancing measures started being implemented, and most local governments implemented some sort of stay-at-home order or some sort of lockdown measure. March 11th onwards and the weeks following March 11th, so the second half of March mainly, that is when the lockdown began in the United States. That is when most people started social distancing. So, in throughout the rest of March, the main focus was just COVID 19. And honestly, that's just the main focus of this entire video. This whole section of the year from beginning of March to end of May, March 11th through May 24th, the main focus for most people were just thinking about COVID more than anything else. So this video is honestly almost completely focused on COVID 19. Honestly, this video could have just been 2 seconds long, and all I would say is COVID 19, because that's essentially what was happening in this part of the year. Everyone was thinking about COVID 19, and for a while it felt like the world was going to end based on how people were reacting, and all sorts of stores like Walmart and Target, they were running out of supplies because a lot of people stocked up on supplies because they weren't sure exactly when the next time they would actually go out. And for a while, everyone was panicking over this virus. A lot of people were panicking over COVID 19. And one good thing that came out of this panic was that the United States Congress, United States federal government, they were able to step in pretty quickly in order to provide some economic relief back in March. So on March 27th, 2020, they passed the CARES Act. Now, the goal of this was to alleviate the economic impacts of this pandemic because as a result of this pandemic, most states, most local governments were implementing some sort of stay at home order, some sort of economic shutdown, and that way the virus would spread less, that way less people would get the virus, but also a negative consequence of that was that more people had to lose their jobs, more people could no longer work. Even without the shutdowns though, a lot of people would still not work because of the fact that this virus was there. There was no getting around that fact. The virus was here, it's not going to go away. So a lot of people, it was unsafe for them to work, especially if they were of old age or had some serious pre-existing health condition. That made the virus especially risky for those kinds of people. And since for those people it was risky to work, that is the reason why the United States federal government stepped in and passed the CARES Act. So this was passed on March 27th, 2020. So the federal government was actually pretty quick in passing this. It only took them a couple of weeks after that March 11th date I first mentioned. March 11th is essentially when this virus started being a big deal in the United States. But on that date itself, March 27th, Congress passed the CARES Act, and it was signed into law by President Trump on March 27th, essentially. So, what the CARES Act did was it provided a one time payment of $1,200 to people below a certain income threshold. So, if you made above that threshold, you didn't get the full 1,200 or you didn't get any of the money. But if you made below the threshold, I don't remember what the exact threshold was, but if you made below that, you would be able to receive $1,200. But apparently, a lot of people didn't receive it even when they should have. But a lot of people also did receive it. And for those people, it was pretty helpful, even though they probably needed more money, but at least they were able to get something. Besides that, this bill also provided unemployed people $600 per month until the end of July, and that is in the next section of this year, which I'll be talking about tomorrow. But for the time being, people had something, people were given something by the federal government, some sort of economic relief by the federal government. So for a while, it seemed like people would be able to make it through this pandemic economically. And for a while, it actually seemed like this pandemic would not last that long. At first, we were just told to stay at home for 2 weeks. That was like right after that March 11th date. We were all told to stay at home for 2 weeks, or 2 to 4 weeks. And most schools at the time were shut down for only 2 weeks or 4 weeks maybe. But then quickly after, like before the end of March, way before the end of March, that was quickly extended to like 4 to 6 weeks. So at first, these social distancing measures were only intended to be implemented for a few weeks, but that kept on getting extended throughout March and April and May, and even afterwards that happened. But since we're talking about March to May of this year, that is essentially what happened with COVID 19. We all thought it would just be 2 weeks of staying at home, and then after that we could get this over with, or maybe 4 weeks, but it lasted a lot longer than that. I guess everybody underestimated how easily this virus spreads and how hard it is to get rid of this virus. But they did announce back in March that a vaccine would take 12 to 18 months. And I guess they were essentially correct on that since the vaccine will be available to most people sometime next spring, hopefully, if not next spring, the next summer. And that does fall within the 12 to 18-month window that they did mention early on in the pandemic. So I'll give them credit for that. I'll give the health experts credit for that and the vaccine producers credit for that. So essentially, COVID 19 was what dominated the mainstream media at that point. It's also what dominated the news cycle at that point in time throughout this whole time period. On March 25th, there was a certain event that I will talk about in tomorrow's video that you probably already know about, but on May 25th, 2020, it seemed like most people stopped focusing so much on COVID 19 and started focusing more on this other topic that I will talk about tomorrow. You probably already know what it is, but I'm just going to talk about now how bad COVID 19 was in the spring. I'll talk about the daily case count and the daily death count. So, on March 11th, 2020, in the United States, if I can pull up the statistic. So, yeah, currently we have almost 20 million cases, 19 million, 19.5 million to be exact, and we have 341,000 deaths in total from this virus in the United States throughout this whole pandemic. But compared to now, the case count and death count was nothing in the spring. But people were still panicking back then a lot more than they are now because of how new this virus was at the time. Most people didn't know about it, so a lot of people were panicking, and that's why I kind of see like the world was going to end soon. A lot of people were stocking up heavily on certain resources. There was a toilet paper shortage. You guys probably heard about that back in the spring because everyone was stocking up on that. Yeah, everyone was panicking. It was pretty. Watching the news at that time was pretty hard to watch because it was pretty scary. Now we're not as scared because we're used to this. It's been like 10 months. It's been almost 10 months since that March 11th date, but that March 11th date is when everything went loose. Everything, the world basically flipped on its side. So on March 10th, 2020, there were only, or March 11th, sorry, March 11th, 2020, there were only 1,300 cases in total in the United States, 1,300 COVID 19 cases. But by the end of March, by April 1st, 2020, that number was already 250,000 cases in the United States. So you went from 1,000 cases approximately to 250,000 cases in the span of 3 weeks essentially. So that just shows how much this virus was spreading at the time. In terms of absolute numbers, it was way less back then than it is now, the amount it was spreading. But in terms of the exponential or logarithmic rate at which this virus was spreading at the time, that is what made it seem so scary. The fact that it went from 1,000 cases on March 11th, around 1,000 cases on March 11th, to around 250,000 cases by early April, by the start of April. That is a 250-fold increase. You went from 1,000 to 250,000. That's 250 times more cases by the start of April than by March 11th. And that is why this virus seemed so scary at the time. The fact that it was increasing at that rate, even though in absolute numbers the daily case count was way less than we're currently experiencing, it seemed a lot scarier then than it does now because of the exponential or logarithmic rate of growth at the time. So throughout March, the daily case count was like 13 to 15,000, and at its peak in April, it was around 34,000. So I say peak as in the peak of that wave of the pandemic, because in total we've experienced 3 waves of this pandemic. The first wave falls within this time frame, falls from March to May. That's basically when this wave took place. That's the other reason why I ended this portion of the year off at May 25th, sorry, because of the fact that that's essentially when this first wave happened. From middle of March to end of May. That's when the first wave took place. And by the end of May, it seemed like things were getting a lot better. It seemed like things would be back to normal after a few more months and that there wasn't that much left. But as we know now, we were completely wrong on that. There was a second wave back in the summer, and now we're in the third wave. We're in the middle of the third wave, which is way worse than either the first or second wave. So at its peak of the first wave, we had 35,000 cases per day. Now we have like 200,000 cases per day. So things have gotten over 4 times worse, basically 6 times worse if you do the math. But then it still seemed pretty bad because we had nothing else to compare it to. Now, if we look at the daily death count, that was actually pretty bad back then. The main reason for that was because of New York. New York was experiencing a lot of deaths back then. They were experiencing at its peak in like early April around 1,000 deaths per day, which is actually a really large number. And the United States as a whole was experiencing around 2,000 to 2,500 deaths per day. So New York was a major contributor to the daily death count back in the spring. Now they have like hardly any deaths, but back in the spring it was completely different. For a while, half of the cases in the country, or a third of the cases in a country, almost half of the cases in the country were from New York. At one point, New York contributed half the deaths in the country and half the cases in the country. So even though the United States case count looked really bad, that was mostly because of New York and to a certain extent New Jersey. New York City, back in the spring of this year, back in March to May of this year, New York City was essentially the epicenter of this pandemic. Not only in the United States, but across the entire world, this city was the epicenter. Early on in the pandemic, before even March 11th, China had the most amount of cases in total. That's pretty obvious considering that the virus originated in China. But only a couple weeks after that March 11th date, I believe it was like by late March or early April, the United States quickly became first place in terms of the number of cases in total, and ever since then we've been number one. The only major event I really remember from this time period that doesn't involve COVID 19 is with Kim Jong un. So basically, around late April, there were reports saying that Kim Jong un was seriously ill. He had to undergo some sort of surgery, and some people were even reporting that he was dead. But it's North Korea, we had no idea what was actually going on. But later on, in like early May, it turned out that there was actually nothing wrong with him. He was perfectly fine. But other than that, though, everybody in this period of the year was mostly just focused on COVID-19. It was this new virus spreading all over the place, and that's mostly what happened in this time period.